Welcome to the final part of this presentation, section three, from World War One to the beginning of World War Two. In this section, we're going to see Japan become a lot more aggressive relatively quickly. So, World War One, it starts in 1914 because the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, or however you pronounce his name, gets assassinated, and the world goes to war. Now, Japan doesn't really have any particular stake in this war per se. It wasn't in any alliance with any of the major powers before it, but except with the exception of Britain. But the Anglo-Japanese alliance had nothing to do with World War One. Yet the Japanese see World War One as an opportunity to take German possessions in China. They want to take whatever land Germany has in East Asia, in the Pacific, for themselves. We have to remember it's 1914. The world still very much is imperialistic, and so Japan joins the Allies on the side of their historic ally, the British, who they still have good relations with since the Boxer Rebellion. So they join their side, and it's relatively smooth fighting for the Japanese. It's not a very intense war for them. They easily take the German islands. They take German forts on the Chinese mainland. They try out some their planes. They try out aerial warfare, so that's a footnote. But overall, it's really not a very difficult conflict for the Japanese. And World War One, Japan's not too important to it. Frankly, they don't do a ton, but they still do fight for the Allies, and they still do some things. But another thing, a thing that happens in World War One that is important is the 21 demands. So Europe, of course, is very distracted in World War One. There's a lot of fighting going on, and Japan sees this not only as an opportunity to take German land in Asia, but also as an opportunity to force the Chinese to agree to certain things that Europe would not usually allow China to agree to. So they issued the 21 demands to the Chinese government. Basically, the 21 demands would make China into a Japanese protectorate, a pseudo colony, if China agreed to them. What it does specifically is it gives Japan more rights in China to mining and expanding their railroad facilities. The Chinese government would be forced to accept Japanese quote unquote advisors, not really advisors, more like dictators. So basically, the Chinese government would listen to the Japanese government in terms of everything. So that's the protectorate part of the deal. Japan would get access to several ports, and all in all, what would happen would Japan would become the major power in China if China agreed to this deal that Japan was trying to force them to sign, the 21 demands. It's this list of 21 demands. Obviously, China really does not like this because they want to be their own country and not a puppet state of Japan. So they leak the 21 demands to Europe and the United States because they were kept secret. Japan kept them a secret. They didn't consult Europe. They didn't ask any of their allies and ask the United States. So they try to do it without them knowing. But China lets them know because they know they won't like it, and they're right. After China leaks the secret 21 demands to the West, there's a lot of international backlash, particularly in the US and Britain. They really don't like this treaty because it's going to take the influence that these two countries have been building up for decades and basically give it away to Japan. So the US in particular has a very negative reaction and claims that it's a violation of Chinese sovereignty. Britain, and then they basically force Japan's hand to remove the worst parts of the 21 demands. So the parts that actually were important get taken out because the US and Britain don't like them. So China ends up signing 13 demands, not 21. And this has a negative effect on Japanese-American relations and also on British-Japanese relations, but that's besides the point. Now, when I say it sours Japanese-American relations, I've been saying this about a lot of events in the Japanese foreign relations. And it is true that all of them do. But what we're going to get into soon is how all of these add up to create a view of the West that leads to events that Japan starts attacking them in World War II. But that's for later in this PowerPoint. Right now, it hurts Japanese-American relations. Japan starts to like American less and less because they wouldn't let Japan get away with making China sign the 21 demands. And then moving on through World War One, Japan actually played a role of kind of a transporter. They moved a lot of British and American troops around Europe in their ships. They rescued a lot of Allied soldiers from sinking ships. They actually rescued quite a lot. So even though they weren't really involved in any of the fighting outside of small skirmishes in Asia, which wasn't the main theater of World War One, they did contribute. And so now America joins the Allies in World War One, 1917. So you see America and Japan fighting for the same side again. So this is, of course, a positive for Japanese-American relations. They're fighting the same side of the war. And then, partially as a consequence of America being on their side, they signed a Lansing-Ishii agreement. So it doesn't get too much new things done. But again, just like the Taft-Katsura agreement was, it's good because now the two nations have diplomatic relations. It's another instance of them talking it out. So it's whenever you sign an agreement with any country, it's always a positive. But basically, the two countries agree to keep China independent, to not, annex them or anything crazy like that. They agreed to give each other equal economic opportunity. So this is very similar to the open door policy America was advocating for. Japan agrees on paper to respect it, partially for a better relation with the Americans. And then the United States, this is probably the biggest part, even this isn't that big. The United States recognizes that Japan has special interests in Manchuria, which again is like very northern China. It's not part of China, not even today, but it's the area a little north of Korea, and it recognizes that Japan has special interests there, and it won't interfere with too much activity in there. So again, there's not much new stuff comes out of this Lansing-Ishii agreement, but it was signed in the middle of World War One. It's a testament to that. The two countries were still communicating diplomatically, and they were not enemies as of yet. World War One and the Japanese economy. The World War One was very good for the Japanese economy. Actually, it helps it start lending out money to other nations instead of borrowing it, a creditor nation, as the PowerPoint slides say. But after the war, it's all very short-term growth. After the war, they go back to normal, and there's a lot of inflation. Just a fun fact. It doesn't have much to do with American-Japanese relations. So the Treaty of Versailles, 1918. This is kind of a landmark moment, not because of anything particularly significant, but just because you have to take a moment to remember that only 65 years ago, Japan had nothing. They were just a backwards island nation, and now they're sitting in Versailles, in the Palace of Versailles, with all the other Western powers negotiating a treaty on the world stage. It's really incredible to see how far Japan comes in such a short amount of time. Not even 100 years, and Japan is a modern, Western, industrialized military power capable of the West letting them sit at the same table. So it's huge growth since 1853. But anyway, back to what's actually relevant to Japan in the Treaty of Versailles. Japan gets to keep the German territory they occupy. They don't have to give it back, so that's nice. They don't get the German territory in China was not extensive, but it is nice that Japan gets to keep it. And now this is actually what I found really interesting about the Treaty of Versailles. Japan proposes what's called the racial equality proposal, basically for the the future League of Nations that's being founded, to recognize that all the member states are equal in terms of race, and that they will not be discriminated against or treated unfairly. Not just Japan, but every race at the Treaty of Versailles. So the Germans, the Italians, not the Germans and Italians, sorry, that they lost the World War One. But basically, Japan's trying to say, America, don't discriminate against us, please, and we won't discriminate against anyone else. No racism. This is an anti-racism proposal. It's a very good thing, right? No, because not to America, which says no, we're not going to approve the racial equality proposal, which Japan proposes in 1918 at the Treaty of Versailles, and Britain doesn't either. There are a couple countries that don't. They say no. We're not. Well, they don't say no. They refuse to support it. So why do they veto this seemingly very good bill to say racism is bad? This is all the racial equality proposal was saying. Racism is bad. We'll treat everyone fairly. The United States votes no. They say no. We're not going to do this. Not exactly the portrait of an inclusive America we paint today, is it? Why they vote no? Because Woodrow Wilson doesn't want to sign this because the very racist Southern Democrats don't like it at all. So he says no. And this hurts Japanese-American relations. It's probably actually a thing America would rather like to forget they did, was vote no on this proposal. It's something we don't learn in school, of course. But it gets voted no. And it hurts Japanese-American relations because, once again, for the millionth time, America refuses to say, yes, Japan, the Japanese people are equal to our own. Instead, what they do is say, no, Americans are better, the Japanese are bad. This is effectively what they're saying. It hurts Japanese Americans significantly. It's the same kind of issue of Americans being racist and Japan not liking it. But now we're past World War One. World War ends. Japan emerges from it roughly the same military power. They didn't increase much of their strength, but the one thing you could say is that their prestige was increased because they fought for the winning side. But overall, Japan emerges roughly the same. And immediately after the war is what's called the Siberian Intervention. For a refresher, the Russian Bolsheviks, the communists, the future Soviet Union started the revolution in World War I, which forced Russia to draw out. And all the Western capitalist nations don't like communism very much. So they decide they're going to go into Siberia and help the non-communist Russians fight the communist Russians. And Japan decides they're going to go with these Western nations too, even though they don't particularly care if Russia is communist or not. Why do they go into Siberia? Japan had very ambitious goals. They wanted to try and get Siberia to separate from Russia to be its own independent state, and then they wanted to do something like they did with Korea. They wanted to increase their influence in Siberia like they did with Korea. They want to be more powerful in that region, and hopefully, if they can, get them to separate from Russia. So they go through the intervention. This is another instance of Japan being on the same side of a conflict as the United States. They go through, but eventually they get west enough to go to Lake Baikal. There's a picture there of where it is relative to Korea, where the arrow is pointing. And then Japan refuses to go westward, even though that would help to fight the communists. They refused to go forward because at that point they were going into very hardcore Russian lands. It was unfeasible for them to increase Japanese influence there, so they decide we're staying here because there's no point to keep going forward for our objectives. For the objectives of defeating the communists, which supposedly they were there for, that's what they told the West, it would be helpful, but that's not their real goals, so they don't. And the United States gets kind of suspicious, like, hey, you said you wanted to fight the communists, why aren't you coming with us forward? So the United States stays behind that Lake Baikal because they're suspicious of the Japanese. And eventually, this whole Siberian intervention is a failure because of all this suspicion of the other, especially the United States and Japan. The other countries were suspicious of each other too, and they didn't work together well. But the United States and Japan in particular do not get along very well, partially because they're increasingly becoming rivals in the Pacific like area. They're international, not enemies, but rivals. They're trying to get power, and that implicitly takes it from the other. So they don't get along in a Siberian intervention. And interestingly, Japan actually refuses to withdraw their troops there, even after all the other countries leave. After Britain, after France, after the United States take their troops away from Siberia and like, all right, the mission's a failure, we're going home. Japan keeps them there. Because again, this is part of their objective. They want to increase Japanese influence in that area. So they keep them there for 2 years, and that draws a lot of international criticism, draws a lot of international suspicion. And eventually, Japan caves into the pressure and takes them out. But it worsened. Overall, the Siberian intervention was a negative for Japanese relations, not just with the United States, but with the entire world, because of their increasingly ambitious, imperialistic, and nationalist policies on the world stage. And practically they don't get anything from the Siberian intervention. It's a failure for basically everyone but the communists in Russia. But it shows just how more aggressive really Japan is coming. So this is almost like foreshadowing the events that are going to occur in Japan in the years to come. Now, the Washington Naval Treaty. So this is relatively immediately after the Siberian intervention, 1922. After World War I, the powers, a couple powers, Britain, United States, and Japan, decide that they don't want an arms race. They want to stop another world war from happening. At least the United States and Britain do. World War I, of course, was devastating. It was a travesty, a lot of death. They don't want it to happen again. And so they want to stop each other from racing to increase their militaries, which was part of the causes of World War I, because all the countries were increasing their militaries and becoming very powerful militarily, which helped spark the huge, massive conflict. So they want to prevent that, and they decide, okay, we're going to sign a treaty so that we all know what our ratio of ships should be, like warships. And what they decide upon, Britain, United States, and Japan, at the Washington Naval Treaty, guess where that was signed, is a 5 to 5 to 3 ratio. Japan having less troops per ratio than Britain and the United States. And you have to remember, Japan agrees to this. This isn't a situation like the unequal treaties where they're forced to. Japan willingly agrees, okay, that's what we're going to do it. This is how we are going to ratio our ships. But this is actually a very controversial treaty in Japan, because increasingly in going into the middle of the 20th century, we're getting there at least, Japan is becoming more nationalistic, more aggressive, and the Japanese people particularly want to be powerful. They don't like how they're going to get less of a powerful military than Britain and the United States. The reason Japan does sign this is because the prime minister wanted to cut military spending. He wanted to focus on the economy and strengthen that aspect of Japanese society rather than the brute force military part of it. But he does end up agreeing to it, and a lot of Japanese, even though this isn't really an act of racial discrimination, they see it as that Britain and the United States won't let Japan be as powerful because they don't like the Japanese and they think they're inferior. That's not really the case, but that's how a lot of Japanese people see it. So that's another negative. Overall, this is kind of a negative treaty for Japan, just how they see Britain and the United States. But they do sign it voluntarily for the reason I just mentioned, that they didn't want to spend too much money in the military, but also because the Japanese leaders at the time knew that they could not compete in an arms race to begin with. That if it came down to it, if they said no to this treaty, the United States would outpace Japanese military production anyway. The United States was a military industrial powerhouse. They could produce so much more than Japan could produce. So in reality, the Japanese leadership at the time saw this treaty as limiting the United States' production of military warships rather than Japan, because there's no way Japan could win in the first place. So it limits the United States, not Japan. That's part of the reason they signed it. But in a nutshell, the powers agreed to not produce too many military warships to prevent a war. And also, fun fact, baseball is actually a very popular sport in Japan. It came to Japan in the 1870s, I think, and it is surprisingly, to any outside observer, the Japanese love the sport. They love it to this day. It's a very competitive sport in high school. There's a lot of drama about it. They have their own Japanese league with similar rules to the US, although there are some different rules. But that's Washington Naval Treaty. Now, yeah, any positive outcome you were hoping for between America and Japan is not going to happen. This is where everything starts to go downhill. Starting with the 1924 American Immigration Law, which is exactly what Theodore Roosevelt had been trying to avoid with the Gentleman's Agreement back in the early 20th century. But 1924, it basically just set a quota on number of Japanese. There's an X amount of Asians, including the Japanese, who can come to America. And of course, Japan doesn't like this. Why? They think it's very racist, and it is kind of racist, to be honest. So it makes the tension between America and Japan greater. You can see especially the racial dynamic between two countries has been getting worse and worse and worse going through the 20th century, meaning they don't like each other as much, meaning they'll be more willing to fight a war with each other. And more generally, the Japanese intellectual class, the Japanese, like the government, the politicians, increasingly as they go forward in time, this isn't an immediate thing, but going through the 1920s to 1940s period, they start to see the West as an obstacle to Japanese growth, as racist, as oppressive, as stopping Japan's divinely given rights to rule all of Asia. Japan sees itself as a natural leader of Asia. It's a divine thing that God has given to them to rule Asia, and they see the West as trying to stop that. And from their point of view, you have to recognize that it does make this theory that the West is oppressive, barbaric, they're an enemy to Japan. There's a lot of things to back it up. Number one, the discrimination against Japanese Americans. So that's that alone is unforgivable in any context. But now, the West had been trying to stop Japan from expanding seemingly since the beginning. They didn't like the 21 demands. After the Russo-Japanese War, they limited the amount of territory Japan could get. Time and time again, you see the West stop Japanese expansionism. You see them say, no, you can't do this. You can't go here. Not cool. This is terrible. You should not do this. And Japan gets really tired of this narrative of being told they can't expand by the West when they believe in this concept of Pan-Asianism, that they should be the ruler of the Asians, and the Asians should be one empire under Japan. And so the West increasingly is seen as an enemy to Japanese expansion, to Japanese military ambition, to the imperialism Japan is striving for. And hand in hand with this growing antagonism towards the West is Japanese militarism. Now, to give a really long and detailed and thorough overview of why militarism found a very strong niche in Japanese society going into the 1920s and 30s is way beyond the scope of this PowerPoint. You could read a book on why Japan increasingly became militaristic. But in a nutshell, the Meiji government, which was set up like 20 slides ago in 1868 after the Meiji Restoration, was not set up with a very good system of checks and balances. It was relatively easy for for one branch of the government to outpace the others. Although it is true that the emperor could theoretically stop anyone, the emperor time and time again proved himself to be not willing to intervene too much with the other aspects of government. So going into the next couple of decades, we're going to see the Japanese military take more and more authoritative action, even if Japan sometimes, the rest of Japan isn't necessarily backing them up. So in a nutshell, bad checks and balances, the military can get away with a lot more than they could in other countries with a better system of checks and balances. Now, the ugly bits of Japanese history, and Japanese-American relations. The Manchurian incident of 1928. So you have the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, right? This is now yet nothing much has happened since the Washington-Naval Treaty, but the Kwantung Army is stationed in Manchuria, in the pieces of Manchuria that Japan controls. Nothing bad yet. But a lot of these soldiers and a lot of the generals in particular are not satisfied with the Japanese foreign policy after World War I. In comparison to what they were doing before World War I, you had Korea, you had fighting the Russians, they see what's going on after World War I as weak, as shameful, as we're not being aggressive enough, we're not being real men. The people in the military were alt-right nationalists, and they're not happy with how soft Japan has been in their eyes. So the Kwantung Army, completely acting rogue, they're completely unauthorized by the actual Japanese government in Tokyo, sets up an inside job by blowing up a train with a particular Chinese warlord on it and then blaming it on his rivals to try to give Japan a reason to go to war. Japan doesn't go to war just yet in Manchuria against anyone, but the bad thing that comes out of this Manchurian incident is that they're not punished. The military leadership in Manchuria who faked a bombing of the Chinese warlord and who blamed it on him, they're not punished. They basically get off scot-free, which sets them up for 3 years later to do something similar because they can get away with it. The goal of the militarists in the Kwantung Army, just to clarify, is to take over Manchuria. So they're trying to probe Japan to be more aggressive and to take Manchuria. So then you have the Mukden incident in 1931, where they do something similar. Manchuria is seen as something that Japan needs, as a resource generator that's going to give Japan the tools it needs to defend itself on the world stage, and going to give a lot of Japanese farmers living space. That should sound very familiar if you're a student of World War II German history. But a lot of militarists begin saying that a war of the world with America is unavoidable and that Japan should go into Manchuria. And then the Kwantung Army in 1931, again, acting on its own, acting rogue, bombs Japanese railroads and blames it on the Chinese, and then uses this, remember, this is completely independent of the Japanese government in Tokyo, uses this as an excuse to go and completely invade and annex Manchuria against the wishes of literally everybody else in the world. This should be sounding a lot of alarms in your head, because this is a very, very Nazi-like thing to do. This is a very fascist kind of foreign policy, invading a country after staging up a fake bombing. So Japan invades Manchuria in 1931 to ostensibly to get paid back on the Chinese who bombed them, but in reality to seize Manchuria for the valuable resources that they believe they will need in the inevitable future war with the world. Because of what I was talking on the last slide, just to tie it all together, because they see the West as forever opposed to what Japan stands for, and that an enemy they're going to have to eventually conquer. So they go into Manchuria to get more resources to make themselves stronger for this inevitable future war. Hopefully that was clear. The territory they seize in Manchuria, they don't officially, call Japan, they make a puppet state, but this puppet state is not very popular with anybody else. So the League of Nations condemns them. They say, this is a terrible thing you've done. You need to retreat right now. This is horrible. And Japan leaves the League of Nations set up after World War One, because of this international criticism, especially from the US, even though they're not in the League of Nations. Everybody basically says, Japan, you screwed up. You should not have done this. This is a terrible thing you're doing. And this basically makes Japan hate everybody, except for the couple of Italy and German politicians who don't criticize them. But America in particular starts really not liking Japan after they forcibly invade Manchuria against international policy. So the United States very much starts warning them, hey, you got to stop. This is act of war. You need to cease doing it. But Japan does not care. And in 1934, breaks the Washington Naval Treaty and begins rapidly producing warships and military planes and all the like. Imagine the point of view of America at this. Japan just invaded Manchuria against international law, just violated the treaty they signed with you not a decade prior to start building more warships. This is literally fitting every metric of Japan wants to fight a war and is extremely aggressive. America and Japan at this point are 100% not friends. They're not going to be friends again until after World War II. They don't like each other. They are not allies. America sees Japan as an overtly ambitious imperialist power that's going to be a threat to American, not only values in the fact that they're not exactly extremely democratic with the Kwanzaa army acting up in Manchuria, but also the fact that they're now seemingly going on a rampage to take all the territory they can. Just how long is it until they start attacking us? So the US is very, very, not scared, but wary of Japanese increasing their influence. In 1936, Japan signs a treaty with Italy and Nazi Germany. This isn't they don't form the Axis powers in 1936. It's called the Anti-Comintern Pact. They just agree not to ally with the Soviet Union. Even though it's not an official alliance, it's setting up the groundwork and the good relations to make an alliance with these fascist countries later. And I cannot imagine a more anti-American thing than to sign a treaty with Hitler. So at this point, Japan and America are completely anti-polar to each other. They're 100% more close to fighting a war than to sitting down and talking things out. America does not like Japan, and Japan does not like America. You're getting to this point. Japan is basically fed up with what they see as just all the stuff the United States has been preventing them from doing, preventing them from expanding. Like they feel that they have the right to, just like they see everyone else doing. And they're going to the dark side, as America sees it, by violating the Washington Naval Treaty and invading Manchuria. Okay, now this is getting depressing. So 1931 to 1936, Japan is invading Manchuria. They're setting up the Manchukuo puppet government. In 1937, they've basically done that, and they don't want to stop there. They decide that they really want all of China now, because that's not a war crime or the violation of international law. So they use a minor skirmish between Japanese troops and some Chinese rogues as an excuse for invading northern China and going into northern China. They don't stop at Manchuria. Again, it's similar reasoning. They basically just want the resources of China. You have to remember, Japan is a barren island country, so they don't have a lot of things to build an empire off of, so they have to invade these countries so they have the natural resources to build their tanks, to build their guns, to build all of that. And they expand rapidly. In the first 5 months of the war, they basically take all of northern China. If you go back to the beginning of this section, you can see just how far Japan gets. If you see the pink in northern China, they take a lot of territory in the Second Sino-Japanese War. You should have predicted it was coming when I called the First Sino-Japanese War the First Sino-Japanese War. But yeah, the Second Sino-Japanese War, Japan goes into China to get as much territory as they can in preparation to fight the Western world at some point in time. And this is where all the Japanese war crimes that are such a sensitive topic today happen, in this Second Sino-Japanese War that happens in 1937, because Japan's trying to get more resources and be an imperialistic power. Particularly, what I'm going to address is I'm going to call it the Nanking Massacre. I don't know if that's exactly how I pronounce it, but the goal of it, well, it wasn't exactly a planned event. Japan didn't go into Nanking, the Chinese city, saying, "Oh, I'm going to commit a war crime," but they didn't stop their troops from attacking these innocent civilians because they wanted to scare the Chinese. They thought if they were sufficiently brutal, sufficiently inhumane to the Chinese people, they would stop fighting and surrender to Japan. They don't. They don't do that, but they still go ahead and let their soldiers rape and murder hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. The reason the soldiers, now if you're talking about why the soldiers did it, is because the Chinese were fighting a guerrilla war. They were practicing guerrilla warfare, and that's extremely frustrating for an organized army because you usually can't see the enemy. They began to see all Chinese as part of the one kind of guerrilla entity, and plus being a soldier is very stressful and harsh. It's not an excuse, but that's partially why this terrible, terrible thing happened, the Nanking massacre. In Japan, Japanese leadership doesn't stop the soldiers from doing this terrible thing. After those initial 5 months where Japan expands rapidly into China, eventually the Chinese forces, both the Communist Party, which rules Japan today, and the Chinese Nationalist Party, which fled to Taiwan after the Second Sino-Japanese War when they lost the Chinese Civil War, they managed to get to a point where they're at a standstill with Japan because Japan doesn't have the resources to fight this extremely heavy Chinese guerrilla warfare, even though they could probably beat the Chinese if they organized themselves into an army and fought Japan in head-on battles. Just like how America couldn't win the Vietnam War because the North Vietnamese used the particularly effective guerrilla warfare in the forests of Vietnam, so Japan can't beat these Chinese forces with their particularly effective guerrilla warfare in China. Even though Japan does take a lot of Chinese territory, but they can't take all of Japan because the Japanese stopped them. And at this point, the military basically controls the Japanese government. Japan can't stop them. Because the emperor refuses to condemn them, refuses to call them out. So Japan basically controls. Japan is basically controlled by the army at this point. An interesting note on Japanese fascism: the Japanese, if they were fascists, they were a very different kind of fascist from the Nazis and from Mussolini's government. It is true that the military controlled a lot of their decisions, but the same kind of social manipulation of Japanese society didn't happen. So Japan really wasn't on the same level of fascism as was Italy and as was Germany, but they definitely still had a very alt-right nationalistic militaristic sentiment that was definitely in control of the country. Now the United States. The United States does not like war crimes. We don't really like war crimes here, no. Which is really a minor thing, as sad as it might seem. The major issue for America is that they're allies with the Chinese. America supports the Chinese nationalist government against the Chinese Communist government. America is friends of China, and they don't like how the Chinese are being massacred by Japanese in this completely unauthorized Second Sino-Japanese War. That is just another domino in the line of Japanese imperialistic alt-right aggression in the 1920s and 1930s. America does not like this, and they finally decide to take some action against their now enemy, Japan. They start an embargo. Franklin Delano Roosevelt starts an oil embargo, an oil and steel embargo, preventing American steel and oil from going to American enemies, in this case, Japan. Japan begins to stockpile oil because, again, island country, not a lot of resources. They need oil to build an army. So Japan is very much alarmed at this oil embargo because without foreign oil, it's going to be very hard to maintain their empire. Yes, and then moving on, after this embargo, Japan officially joins the Axis powers with Italy and Germany in 1940 because they're going to need the support of their friends in the Axis powers against the increasing American, not aggression, but hostility to their military ambition. So after this, FDR organizes an international embargo to punish Japan for joining the Axis powers, which FDR does not like. He is not a fan of the Axis powers. He organizes an international embargo that's even harsher than the domestic embargo he organized a couple of years earlier. Now, part of the reason Japan allies with the Axis is because their strategy to counter the American oil embargoes to make up for the lack of foreign oil they're going to get is to take more and more of South Asia militaristically to get that oil to make up for that lack. So when Hitler goes when Hitler's regime takes over the Vichy regime in he establishes the Vichy regime in France. He gets all of the French colonial possessions, all of the French territory that France used to own in Indochina, which is South Asia. And so Hitler, as an ally of Japan, lets Japan go into Indochina for its oil reserves and to control the territory. So the French holdings in Indochina basically become Japanese territories in South Asia for Japan to exploit for oil and as a strategic location for war. And at this point, the two countries are trying. I say trying with quotation marks, they're really not trying to figure something out, a compromise, but both are extremely stubborn. America will not accept anything but the complete giving back all of the Chinese territory. Remember, China is an American ally. Giving back all the Chinese territory to the Chinese, which Japan does not want to do. They're not willing to go back from Indochina. No, they're willing to go back from Indochina. They're not willing to go back from normal China because, alt-right nationalism. And Americans don't like how the Japanese are a threat to their economic interests in China. It's going to be a threat to the American the benefits of the American economy if Japan continues to control China. So the two countries are at a standstill and they can't negotiate anything. Last slide. So Japan being embargoed or having an oil embargo issued on them by America, being ostracized from all the non-Axis powers, sees only one option for itself. If they continue to expand, eventually they'll have to fight a war with America anyway. They decide, in the classic vein of thought as alt-right nationalism suggests, they decide to try and scare America into backing off from countering their ambition and controlling Asia and controlling the oil fields of South Asia by going into Pearl Harbor. So they think that if they bomb Pearl Harbor, America will be so scared that they'll withdraw the oil embargoes that threatens Japan's hold on the territories they've seized, and will just let Japan expand through Asia. That doesn't happen. Japan fights World War II, which is irrelevant to a discussion of American-Japanese relations before World War II, which was the goal of this PowerPoint. With that, the Japanese empire falls. After World War II, they cannot counter the American industrial might, the capacity to repair their warships. After the Battle of Midway, things become increasingly dire for Japan, and so Japan gets nuked twice by America, and they surrender. The Americans occupy Japan, actually, after World War II, which is, understandable. They won the war. They forced Japan to modernize again, but in this case, with respect to democracy, they take away the old kind of pseudo-democracy system they had with the National Diet, and they implement a more modern, direct-to-the-people approach. And they also force them to agree to never, ever, ever, ever have a military, which is still a policy today. Japan has a self-defense force, but they don't have like an army because America won't let them after the travesties they committed before World War II. That is the history of Japanese-American relations. America made Japan into a world power, and they took them out. And then Japan became a world power again, but this time not an imperialistic one, an economic powerhouse. And Japan is still a very modern, very powerful, influential nation today. Thank you for listening to this extremely long presentation, and have a great day.